New Year's Eve was always the highlight of Rachel's year. This time, she had decided to host a small party at her new countryside house, inviting a handful of friends to celebrate. The house was old, creaky, and surrounded by dense woods, but she thought it added to the charm. By 8 p.m., the guests started trickling in. Her college roommate, her work friends, even her high school bestie. The atmosphere was lively as they drank, laughed, and swapped resolutions. Around 10 p.m., Rachel noticed something odd. There was a man sitting at the corner of the room, wearing a plain black hoodie. His face was partially obscured, and he hadn't spoken a word all night. "Who's that?" she whispered to her friend Mia. Mia glanced over. "I don't know. I thought he was one of your friends." Rachel frowned. She was sure she hadn't invited him, but with all the excitement, maybe a +1 had slipped by. She didn't want to be rude, so she let it slide. As the clock approached 11 p.m., Rachel noticed the man hadn't moved. While the others danced and mingled, he stayed in his corner, staring at the group with an unsettling intensity. Her unease grew. "Hey everyone," she announced, forcing a laugh to mask her nerves. "Let's take a group photo." The guests gathered in the living room, and Rachel set up her phone on a timer. The man stayed seated. "Come on," she called, waving him over. He didn't respond, didn't even blink. The timer beeped, and the photo was taken. Rachel picked up her phone and stared at the screen. Her heart stopped. The man wasn't in the photo. Her breath hitched as she looked up at the corner where he had been sitting. The chair was empty. "Did anyone see him leave?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Her guests exchanged confused glances. "Who are you talking about?" Mia asked. "The guy in the hoodie! He was sitting right there!" "Rachel," her friend David said slowly, "there was no one there." Rachel's stomach dropped. She grabbed her phone and scrolled through the pictures she'd taken throughout the night. In every single photo, there was no trace of the man. "Okay, this isn't funny," she snapped. Just then, the power cut out, plunging the house into darkness. The guests screamed and fumbled for their phones, their flashlights creating eerie shadows that danced along the walls. "Everyone stay together!" Rachel shouted, her voice shaking. But as the lights from their phones flickered, she realized something chilling. The group was smaller. People were missing. "Mia?" she called, but there was no response. One by one, her friends began vanishing. She could hear faint footsteps, muffled screams, but whenever she turned to look, there was nothing. Finally, it was just Rachel, standing alone in the middle of her dark living room. She could feel someone watching her, the hairs on her neck standing on end. Slowly, she turned around. The man in the hoodie was standing inches away, his face finally visible. His eyes were hollow, black voids, and his grin stretched unnaturally wide. "You're the last one," he whispered, his voice low and rasping. Rachel screamed as he lunged toward her. When the clock struck midnight, the lights flickered back on. The house was silent, empty. The next day, police arrived after neighbors reported strange noises. They found the house spotless, as though no party had ever taken place. On the coffee table was a single photo. It showed Rachel and her friends, all smiling brightly, but standing behind them, clear as day, was the man in the hoodie. It was New Year's Eve, and Kevin was dreading the party his friends had dragged him into attending. When midnight approached, he decided he'd had enough. Without saying goodbye, he grabbed his keys and left. The drive home was eerie. Snow fell steadily, muffling the world around him, and the roads were deserted. Kevin flipped on the radio to break the silence, but all he could find was static. As he turned down a winding forested road, his headlights caught something in the distance. A woman was standing by the side of the road, her dress torn and her face pale. She raised a trembling hand, signaling for help. Kevin hesitated. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no way she'd survive out here in this weather. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. "Are you okay?" he asked, rolling down the window. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible. "Can you take me home?" Kevin nodded, unlocking the door. She slid into the passenger seat without a word. Her hands were icy, and her eyes stared blankly ahead. "What happened?" he asked as he started driving. I was at a party," she whispered. "I needed to leave." Kevin glanced at her, uneasy. Something about her felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "Where do you live?" he asked. She gave him an address, one that sounded familiar. Kevin frowned, trying to place it. As they drove, the woman began to hum softly, a tune Kevin couldn't recognize. The sound made his skin crawl. He finally realized where he'd heard the address. It was an abandoned house, infamous in the area for a tragedy that had occurred years ago. A woman had been killed there on New Year's Eve, her body never found. "Are you sure this is where you live?" he asked, his voice shaky. She turned to him, her face now illuminated by the dashboard light. Her eyes were sunken, her skin mottled with bruises. Kevin slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said, her voice suddenly cold and menacing. Kevin's headlights flickered, and when he looked again, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, but her voice echoed in his ears. When he finally reached the abandoned house, his curiosity got the better of him. He stepped out, flashlight in hand, and approached the door. It creaked open on its own, revealing a dusty, untouched interior. On the mantel was a framed photo of the woman from his car, smiling brightly in a party dress. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. He turned, but there was no one there. The air grew colder, and he heard the hum again, soft at first, then louder, surrounding him. The flashlight flickered and went out. When the townspeople found Kevin's car the next morning, it was still running, the driver's door wide open. There was no sign of him, only faint, icy footprints leading from the road to the abandoned house, where they vanished entirely. Jack hated New Year's Eve. Too many people, too much noise, and the pressure of pretending he cared about resolutions. So this year, he stayed home in his tiny apartment, flipping channels and waiting for the ball to drop. Around 10 p.m., his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number lit up his screen. "You're not alone." Jack chuckled nervously. Probably a prank. He ignored it and kept scrolling through his phone. A few minutes later, another message popped up. "Stop ignoring me." His stomach tightened. He typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came instantly. "Check the window." Jack's pulse quickened. Slowly, he turned his head toward the large living room window. Outside, the streetlights glowed dimly, illuminating empty sidewalks. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air. There was nothing unusual. Relieved, Jack shot back a response. "Nice try. Not funny." But as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. His small apartment felt too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears. At 11:15, another message arrived. "You locked the door, right?" Jack froze. His eyes darted toward the front door. It was locked, wasn't it? His heart pounding, he stood and crept toward the door, checking the deadbolt. Secure. He exhaled a shaky breath and typed, "Whoever this is, leave me alone." No reply. The TV blared in the background, the countdown to midnight growing louder. Jack tried to shake off the unease. He sat back on the couch, forcing himself to focus on the screen. At 11:45, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. The picture showed Jack sitting on his couch, staring at his phone. He leapt to his feet, his phone slipping from his hand. Someone was in the apartment. His eyes darted around the room, but it was empty. He grabbed a kitchen knife, his hands trembling. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Silence. Another buzz. Another photo. This one showed him standing by the kitchen counter, knife in hand. He whirled around, slashing at the empty air. Nothing. No one. As the seconds ticked closer to midnight, His phone buzzed again and again, more photos arriving in rapid succession. Each one showed him in real time, pacing, sweating, eyes darting around in terror. Finally, the last message came. Midnight. The clock struck 12 and Jack's TV went dark. The room was plunged into darkness except for the glow of his phone. Then, a hand clamped over his mouth from behind. The next morning, neighbors called the police after hearing screams. They found Jack's apartment in perfect order, no sign of struggle. On the couch, his phone sat open to a final, chilling photo. It showed Jack, eyes wide in terror, as a figure loomed behind him, grinning. Lisa was a night owl, always tuning into obscure late-night radio shows while working her graveyard shifts as a security guard. Her favorite was a program called The Midnight Signal, a show that played haunting stories submitted by listeners. One New Year's Eve, she tuned in as usual. The host's calm, gravelly voice filled her small office. Good evening, night wanderers. Tonight's story comes from a caller who claims to have lived it. Stay tuned because this one will chill you to the bone. Lisa leaned back, sipping her coffee as the tale began. The story was about a woman working late at night, just like Lisa. She was alone, listening to a radio show when strange things started happening. She heard a faint knocking, the host narrated, his voice deliberate, coming from the hallway. At first she thought it was her imagination, but the knocking grew louder and closer. Lisa smirked. A little on the nose, she thought. She glanced at the dimly lit hallway on her security monitors. Empty as usual. The story continued. She checked her cameras. Everything looked normal. But when she looked closer, she noticed something strange. A shadow, moving where it shouldn't be. Lisa's smirk faltered. On instinct, she glanced at her monitors again. Her heart skipped a beat. A shadow moved across the far end of the hallway. She shook her head, convincing herself it was a trick of the light, but her hand hovered over the button to lock the office door. The host's voice deepened. She decided to lock her door, just to be safe, but then the knocking started again, this time on her office door. A sharp rap echoed through Lisa's small office. She froze, the coffee cup slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. Her breath quickened. She stared at the door, but the frosted glass showed no silhouette. She thought she was imagining it, the host said, his tone now almost a whisper, until the voice came through. Let me in, a low voice growled from the other side of Lisa's door. She stumbled backward, knocking her chair over. Who's there? She shouted, her voice trembling. Silence. Her radio crackled. She tried to call for help, the host continued, but her phone was dead. The radio was all she had left. Lisa grabbed her phone. No signal. Her eyes darted to the radio. She thought she could outlast it. She thought she was safe. But she didn't realize it was already inside. Lisa's blood ran cold. The door to her office creaked open, inch by inch, though she knew it was locked. Her monitors flickered, showing static. Then, one by one, the cameras came back online. On every single feed, a figure stood. It wore a long, dark coat, its face obscured by shadows. The host chuckled softly, and now, dear listeners, she's not alone anymore. The radio clicked off. Lisa's scream never reached the airwaves. The next guard found the office empty the following morning. The radio was on, playing nothing but static. On the desk, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a single message. I let it in.